Christian Chaplains in Coaching has produced a certification course in counseling for grief. This is especially suitable to help train your volunteers, your ministry staff, even your church members in the basics of biblical counseling so that a compassionate care ministry might be developed and created with mature lay believers that you are doing life with in the day-to-day stuff of life. It will also help you, the professional chaplain, build and train your team. You'll find it linked in this week's course materials. Let us remind you here about the importance of building community. And please remember that you cannot do this work alone. You need a team. You need a community of people of faith. After all, discipleship can only be accomplished in the context of mission when people are serving together like family with Jesus at the center. And some call it a life group or even a small group, but we like to call it a missional community. Disciples cannot be made by only attending weekly meals and a Bible study. No Lone Rangers in Christian chaplaincy. You serve on mission with others and find a way to include them in your ministry. That is wisdom. In Christian literature, the words of Moses are recorded in a really wise teaching found in Psalm 90, verse 12, saying, "So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom." Now, there is a difference between knowing something and doing it, knowledge and wisdom. According to the Bible Knowledge Commentary, knowledge is the apprehension of truth, while wisdom is its application to life. Knowledge is prudent judgment, but wisdom is prudent action. One can have knowledge, but without application for changed living, it's useless. Knowing and doing are not the same. Now, the book of James speaks to this truth. To live with our own death in mind, as suggested by Moses, will help us have a heart of wisdom so that we will live well for God in the here and now, which is only temporary. Life is best put into perspective in light of eternity, which requires a focus on spiritual things. In other words, we need to learn how to live today with our own death in mind while helping others do the same. For death, it comes for us all. The stats are in, and it is certain that the death rate is 100%. No matter how marvelous a medical miracle might be in restoring a person to life, yet they will still die. Consider Lazarus, who died, and in an amazing miracle, Jesus raised him from the dead. Lazarus still died a second time. But somehow I imagine his thoughts about life and death were very different the second time around. And this should be something to reflect on. What does our faith teach us about life and death? How will we respond in wisdom and help others navigate these troubled waters? How we live in light of that is what will matter the most. Living is not the same as wise living. Death is a difficult subject. Most people, even people of faith, shy away from deep conversations about death. It's a topic too easily put off to a future time when we think we'll be more comfortable talking about it. But for most, that time never comes. Not until they come face to face with a dying loved one, and then they're often ill-prepared to deal with it. And that's where our work as chaplains can really shine. We create a safe, encouraging environment that allows people to talk about these difficult subjects, like death, helping them come to grips with important and needed documents, like a last will and testament or living trust, advanced care directives, durable powers of attorney for financial or medical decisions. These are all important things. You might even want to add an estate planning attorney to your team, especially one who is experienced in elder care law. Such documents make life so much easier for family. They should be a priority, but many people put them off, these discussions, for fear of addressing the need. We're available when someone receives the news that their loved one has a life-threatening or terminal diagnosis. They're often forced to watch their loved one die while having no idea what to even expect during the dying process or how to deal with the actual moment of death when it comes. These things present many attitudes, emotions, and challenges to their beliefs and values. Such responses are unique to each individual person, and we are expected to help guide their ship through uncharted waters during a terrible storm. Therefore, we chaplains must have knowledge regarding end-of-life issues so that we can provide the very best care possible. This is an important subject for every chaplain. You must become familiar with topics like understanding the physical changes that happen during the dying process, how a person's spiritual, religious, or cultural views explain death and dying in a meaningful way to them, and the conflicts that often exist between dying persons and their families. They must make decisions, and frequently they're misinformed about terms like hospice and palliative care. They hear these words, and they associate them with the death sentence, causing them to respond with denial because they don't really understand what the terms actually mean. Some people hear the word hospice, and they say, "That's just a death factory. Don't go there because you'll die." Well, actually, the person is already dying, which is why hospice is so incredibly important. As chaplains, you must be able to explain these things in terms that they can understand. And this implies you thoroughly understand them yourselves. And how can you assist both the family and the interdisciplinary team in making important decisions for care and treatment? People have difficulty talking about death. They suffer from fear and anxiety. They're unsure how to talk about it. Some cultures even discourage talking about it, making it even more difficult for we chaplains. And for these reasons, they often fail to talk it out, which may be the most spiritually healing thing they could actually do. This is one of the chaplain's special tasks and responsibilities. We get them to talk it out, achieve some peace, and make some decisions. In the physiological process of death, dying is described as a medical process, but it's far more than that to the patient and the family, and we know it's more than that too. It is personal, it's communal, social, and it's spiritual. And what does fish breathing look like and mean when a person reaches the final hours or minutes? How can you help the family know that this is normal and it's not causing undue stress for their loved one? Death from a sudden accident will look very different from death caused by a long and protracted disease. People close to the situation will suffer a variety of dramatic emotional responses. Kubler and Ross updated the well-known stages of grief to 7 stages in 1974. It's helpful to understand what is happening in each stage, starting with shock, which is an uncontrolled automatic self-defense mechanism. As in a physical injury, shock numbs the pain at first, at least until the shock wears off. Person often experiences shock when they receive unexpected bad news about themselves or their loved ones, likelihood of imminent death. Then denial is a refusal to accept the reality of the news. No, it can't be. I refuse to accept it. In every 12-step recovery program, the very first step that must take place to lead a person back to normalcy is to step out of denial and accept the truth. And then anger, which is normal. Even anger at God is to be expected. People will lash out in anger, even angry and directed at you, the helpful Christian chaplain. Don't take it personally. Just listen, love, love. Then bargaining occurs as a person thinks about what they may have done wrong that maybe might have caused the death, or begging God to heal their loved one, and in return they'll obey God. This stage can be quite irrational, and as with the other stages, they may need help processing through it. Depression is also to be expected as part of the grief process. Depression for up to a year is perfectly normal. Then testing. Testing is when the person begins to experiment with living life in this new normal, the one without their loved one in it. They move from bargaining to dialogue as they begin to reach back out to others and reestablish relationships in their new reality. This period of testing will help them learn how to handle their day-to-day stuff of life without their loved ones' help and without their input. And finally, acceptance. That's where the turn back to a mostly normal life can take place, but sadly, some people never reach this stage. and become the recipients of professional therapy for the rest of their lives. Chaplains should know how to identify these stages while offering a loving presence with active listening. It would be so nice, wouldn't it, if everyone would just process through these stages in the exact order and within a known period of time for each one. It would be easier because then we would know right where they are in the process, and we could chart out the day of their expected recovery. But unfortunately, it just does not happen like that. Every person is different. Everyone experiences these things in their own way, in their own order, with their own intensity and length of time, often going from one back to another. It is completely unpredictable, and our job is not to hurry them through, but to guide them through it as they make progress on their own time and their own schedule, not ours. In providing a loving presence combined with effective spiritual care, chaplains do their very best to help people return to a meaningful life. They transition from normal functioning that is interrupted by the loss or bad news, and hopefully return to normal life with some degree of meaning and hopefully, an even stronger faith. And this takes time. It may well take up to a year. Let me point something out. It is often missed in clinical teaching on the subject of bereavement and grief. Too often, the terms are thought of in the same way to mean the same thing, and too often, also, they're associated only with death. So let me clarify some terminology for you here. Of course, there are differences of opinion, but know this: bereavement is not grief. Well, okay, but what is grief? How do we define it, and are there different kinds of grief? Yes, there are. Grief, simply put, is a type of stress reaction. Grief is a highly personal and subjective response that an individual will have to a real or perceived or anticipated loss. And grief is not only produced by the tragic loss of a loved one to death. There are many kinds of loss that can and will produce grief symptoms. But there are different types of grief that you should know. Now, everyone has heard the term bereavement before, but how is this term different from grief? Well, the easiest way to understand the difference is to know that bereavement is referring to the actual reality or state of a loss. Any person who experiences a loss of any kind is technically in the current experience of bereavement. The word describes the reality that a loss has taken place. It's been experienced. In clinical settings, this is almost always associated only with death. It would be a mistake in our understanding of that word, though, to limit it only to death. Grief is different. Grief is used to describe the emotional response that a person has to the loss that they experience. So bereavement is the actual loss. Grief is the emotional response in the aftermath. Many times a person will experience grief without bereavement. Perhaps they fear a possible loss that hasn't even happened. Or maybe they anticipate a loss is coming based on the news they receive about a possible loss that causes them to grieve now as if it has happened. Technically, they're not bereaved because the loss hasn't actually occurred, and yet they experience grief. So what are some types of grief to know about? Well, imagine that someone you know is diagnosed with cancer, and the prognosis is not good. As your friend or loved one, you want them to survive. You want them to be healed, and you pray to God for their healing, and you try to put a positive spin on the expected outcome. Even when the person has been given a death sentence, a well-meaning friend may actually deny the reality and proclaim that the person will be healed and live a long life, but they die anyway. Chaplains never, ever, ever make such promises that we have no control over. But people will deny the reality, won't they? Denial is a stage of grief, and here it is the anticipation of grief that causes the denial. Other things that can trigger one or more of the various emotions of grief include things like a pending terrible storm with tornadoes headed your way, or a drop in the economy and fear of losing your job, or a global pandemic. Things Things like these that have not actually produced a loss yet, which is bereavement, will often produce something called anticipatory grief. We're anticipating it and we begin to grieve though we haven't experienced it. Now, there's another form of grief that's also very real to many. Let's say your good friends who live next door have a 14-year-old daughter that enjoys being with you and your family. She is grieving that her 16-year-old boyfriend broke up with her to be with someone else after just a few months of dating. Society often doesn't feel very strongly about this kind of grief and may not give her permission to actually grieve. Or another example could be an ex-spouse who is the father of the children dies. And especially when there was infidelity and cheating resulting in a divorce and his remarriage to the very woman he committed adultery with, his death later may trigger grief with the ex-wife. But society and culture and friends may treat it more like, well, he finally got what was coming to him, so why are you grieving? This type of grief experienced by the teenager and the ex-wife is called disenfranchised grief. It is a grief experienced by someone where their culture and society doesn't acknowledge it and fails to give them permission to actually grieve. A chaplain can give them the permission they need to grieve well so they can be healed of its symptoms. Sometimes the person grieves so deeply and for so long that it becomes difficult for them to return to a normal life. Any grief that produces intensified emotions, the kind that last longer than 6 months or a year, well, that might be caused by complicated grief. So it will be important to help a person in complicated grief get some professional help. Left untreated, it can disable them from ever returning to normalcy. End of life produces an especially profound grief. Remember that time in Scripture when those disciples and Jesus were crossing the Sea of Galilee in a terrible storm, threatening to take their lives? Jesus was asleep, calm as can be, in the back of the boat. But the disciples were filled with panic and fear as they struggled to not drown, and they feared that they were going to drown. So they woke Jesus up and they begged him to do something, saying, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And Jesus woke up and rebuked the storm, and immediately it passed, and the waters calmed. Their fear then turned to terror. Who is this in our boat? Well, the unstated obvious is that only God has control over nature, and they would not expect to survive a face-to-face encounter with God. But now in our salvation, we have Christ's Holy Spirit actually dwelling in each of us. We bring the sacred presence with us into these end-of-life encounters. He can calm the storm, and we have been given the pastoral authority that resides in us to bring peace to these grieving people. You need to prepare yourself for this so that you can bring some degree of peace, calming their storm, speaking with His authority to rebuke it. But first, has He calmed your storm? Maybe you should ask Him about that.